Okay, so get ready to journey back in time. We're diving into the Silk Road.
Ooh, exciting.
I'm betting you already picture like flowing silk, maybe a caravan or two, and definitely something ancient.
Yeah, yeah.
But as with anything we deep dive into, there's always more to this story, right?
Absolutely. You've got those iconic images spot on. But what's truly fascinating is how the Silk Road was so much more than just a trade route. It was this complex web of cultures, ideas, even diseases, all intertwined and spanning well over thousands of miles and centuries.
Thousands of miles, you say. I have to admit, even I always pictured something, well, smaller, more like a single road, you know?
Yeah.
What was the actual scope of this network?
That's where the name Silk Road gets a little misleading. In reality, we're talking about a network that thrived for over 1,500 years, longer than many empires, connecting East Asia to Southern Europe and East Africa.
Wow,
That's a whole lot of ground covered.
1,500 years. Okay, color me intrigued because that definitely changes my perception already. So help me wrap my head around these multiple routes you mentioned. Where were the key routes? What made each of them so important?
Okay, so imagine this. A northern route stretching all the way from Chang'an, an ancient capital of China, westward towards the Mediterranean. Now picture this. Luxury goods like spices, perfumes even, glassware from Persia, Somalia, India, even as far as Egypt, flowing right into the heart of China.
Wow.
It's mind-boggling.
Like a treasure map in my mind. No wonder this network was so influential. What about going in the other direction? I know Chinese silk was a hot commodity, but what else was traveling west?
So silk was definitely the start, right?
Mm.
But don't underestimate the appeal of Chinese tea, porcelain, and lacquerware. These weren't just goods. They represented wealth, sophistication, a taste of the exotic. They actually shaped desires and trends across completely different cultures.
That's fascinating how something we might consider commonplace today had such a huge cultural impact back then. It means you appreciate the power of objects and their stories.
Exactly. And remember, this wasn't limited to just one route. We have the southern route, which was quite challenging, winding through the towering Karakoram Mountains.
Oh, wow.
Today, that same route is the modern-day Karakoram Highway connecting Pakistan and China. But back then, it was critical because it provided access to sea travel,
Right?
opening up trade to a whole new level.
Okay, so we have the northern route bringing in goods from the west, and the southern route connecting to the sea, creating even more possibilities for trade. Were there any other important routes within this network?
There's another route that might surprise you, the southwestern route, which historians believe went through the Gangsa-Brahmaputra Delta in modern-day Bangladesh.
Bangladesh. Now, that's not what I expected. What made that area so significant in this ancient trade network?
It's incredible, right?
Yeah.
Historical records, such as ancient Roman texts and Ptolemy's map of the Ganges Delta, point to this area being a bustling hub of trade long before the Common Era. We're talking precious gemstones, exotic merchandise from Thailand, Java, all being traded through this delta. It just goes to show you how interconnected the world was even back then.
It really challenges the way we think about history, doesn't it? I mean, we often picture these ancient civilizations as isolated, but the Silk Road paints a completely different picture.
It does, and we haven't even touched on the maritime routes yet. The Maritime Silk Road was a game changer, but that's a story for another part of our journey.
Okay, you've definitely piqued my curiosity. Let's set sail on the Maritime Silk Road and discover what treasures await. All right, we're setting sail on the Maritime Silk Road. Now, this is where I imagine things get really interesting. What made this sea route so different, so impactful compared to the land routes we've been exploring?
Get ready for a whole new perspective. You see, while caravans traversed, challenging terrain with limited cargo, the Maritime Silk Road, that was like the express lane of ancient trade. We're talking massive Austronesian ships sailing across the Indian Ocean, from Southeast Asia to East Africa, connecting with those land routes and even pushing further to Europe.
Wow.
The sheer volume of goods they could move, it was a game changer.
It's amazing to think about these ancient mariners navigating vast oceans to connect the world. What kinds of goods were sailing on these routes? Was it all silk and spices, or were there other treasures being traded?
Silk and spices were still stars of the show, of course, but the maritime routes allowed for bulkier, heavier items, timber, ceramics, even animals, to be traded on a much larger scale. This changed the economic landscape, creating new markets, new opportunities. It's a reminder that globalization isn't just a modern phenomenon, it's been unfolding for centuries.
It really broadens your perspective, doesn't it?
Right.
I mean, we often think of the ancient world as limited by geography, But the Maritime Silk Road shows just how interconnected things really were.
And remember how we talked about those cultural exchanges along the land routes? Well, the Maritime Silk Road amplified that exchange. Buddhism, for example, spread more rapidly thanks to these sea routes, reaching parts of Southeast Asia much faster than it could by land.
So it wasn't just goods and spices traveling these maritime highways, but ideas, beliefs as well. It makes you wonder, were there any downsides to this interconnectedness? I mean, even today, we see the challenges of global trade.
That's a crucial point. Just like today, the increased movement of people and goods came with risks, and one of the most significant downsides was, unfortunately, the spread of disease. The Black Death, one of the most devastating pandemics in history, is believed to have traveled from Central Asia to Europe along these very trade routes.
It's a stark reminder that even with progress and interconnection, there are always challenges to navigate. I imagine the Black Death had a profound impact, not just on populations, but on the Silk Road itself.
You're exactly right. The Black Death had a devastating impact on trade, disrupting routes, causing widespread fear. It's a reminder of the fragility of these networks, even ones as vast and seemingly invincible as the Silk Road.
It's a good point. We often focus on the positive aspects of globalization, but it's essential to understand the complexities, the challenges that come with interconnectedness.
Absolutely. But even amidst these challenges, the Silk Road thrived. And that's largely due to the incredible people who kept those goods, ideas, and cultures flowing.
Speaking of incredible people, you mentioned earlier that the Sogdians were key players in this story. What made them so important to the Silk Road's success?
Think of the Sogdians as like the ultimate networkers of the ancient world. They were masters of language, culture, and most importantly, trade. They weren't just merchants, they were diplomats, navigating complex political landscapes, forging connections that spanned continents. Their ability to adapt to different cultures was remarkable. Imagine, for instance, a Sogdian merchant arriving in, say, a bustling Chinese marketplace. He seamlessly blends in, speaking the local language, respecting customs, and negotiating deals with a shrewdness that would make even today's business tycoons envious.
They sound like the ultimate cultural chameleons. Their story reminds me that the Silk Road wasn't just about the goods, it was about the people, their resilience, their ability to adapt and connect with others who are vastly different from them.
Exactly. The Sogdians highlight the human element of this vast network, but their influence, while significant, eventually gave way to another powerful force that would reshape the Silk Road, the Mongols.
Yes, the Mongols. I know they had a massive impact on Asia, but how did their empire influence this ancient trade network?
Their impact was significant, though relatively short-lived. When the Mongols swept across Asia, they took control of vast sections of the Silk Road. And while their reputation often precedes them, they actually brought a period of stability and peace, which, ironically, revitalized trade along the Silk Road.
So, the Mongols, often associated with conquest and chaos, actually facilitated a period of peace and prosperity along the Silk Road. That's not what I expected.
It's one of history's many fascinating contradictions, and it was during this period of Mongol rule that figures like Marco Polo ventured eastward, traveling along the Silk Road and bringing back tales of the Orient that would captivate the imaginations of Europeans for centuries to come.
It's incredible to think about the impact of his journey, the stories he shared, and how they shaped perceptions of the East. But there's a bit of a historical debate surrounding the Silk Road, isn't there? I've heard some historians even call it a myth. That's a pretty strong statement. What's the reasoning behind that?
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of how we interpret history. While the Silk Road was undoubtedly a significant network of exchange, some historians argue that its prominence has overshadowed the importance of other trade routes that existed at the same time.
So it's not that the Silk Road didn't exist. It's more about acknowledging that it wasn't the only player in the game.
Exactly. Take the maritime spice trade, for example. It had a huge impact on the Roman Empire and influenced global trade routes in ways that were just as significant as the Silk Road. Focusing solely on the Silk Road, some argue, creates an incomplete picture of global trade in the ancient world.
That makes sense. It's like studying a single tree instead of appreciating the entire forest. But even if the Silk Road wasn't the only trade route, it's still an incredible story of cultural exchange and interconnectedness. It makes you wonder, though, what legacy did it leave behind? It's incredible to think about the Silk Road's legacy. We've gone from picturing a single route to understanding this vast network of trade, cultural exchange, and even, as we've learned, pandemics. What does all of this mean for us today? Is there even a connection to make to the 21st century?
The connections are more relevant than you might think. The Silk Road, even if it wasn't the only trade network of its time, still offers a powerful lens through which to view our own interconnected world. It reminds us that globalization isn't a new phenomenon. It's been shaping our world for millennia.
It's like looking in a mirror, isn't it? We see our own desires for connection, for trade, for new ideas reflected back at us from centuries ago.
Precisely. And just like the Silk Road connected East and West, today's global networks tie us together in intricate ways. Think about the internet, the global supply chain. They're like modern-day Silk Roads, moving information and goods across the planet at an unprecedented pace.
It makes you wonder, though, are we repeating history's patterns? Are there lessons we can learn from the Silk Road successes and failures to help us navigate our own interconnected world?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? One key takeaway is the importance of balance. The Silk Road thrived when there was a balance of power, when different cultures exchanged ideas and goods on a relatively level playing field. But when that balance shifted, when empires rose and fell, it often led to disruptions or even the decline of the network.
So if we want our modern Silk Roads to thrive, we need to ensure fairness, cooperation, and mutual benefit. It can't just be about one power dominating the network.
Exactly. Another crucial lesson lies in understanding the interconnected nature of global challenges. Just as the Black Death spread along the Silk Road, impacting trade and societies far and wide, today we face challenges like climate change and pandemics that require global cooperation and a shared sense of responsibility.
It's a sobering thought, but also empowering. By understanding the interconnectedness of our world, we can work together to address these challenges and create a more sustainable and equitable future.
And who knows, maybe by studying the successes and failures of the Silk Road, we can chart a course for a more interconnected world that benefits everyone.
It's an inspiring thought. We've journeyed through time, explored vast networks, and uncovered hidden connections. If there's one thing I'm taking away from this deep dive, it's that the Silk Road wasn't just a historical event. It's a reflection of who we are. Our desire to connect, to explore, to shape our world together.
Well said. It's a story that continues to unfold, even today.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this incredible journey through time and across continents. But before we go, I have one final question for you to ponder. What are the Silk Roads of today, and how will they shape the world of tomorrow?
I'll leave you with that thought-provoking question. Until next time, keep those brain gears turning.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration.